Welcome to Handy HQ. If you like to build stuff, fix stuff, make stuff, you've arrived at the right channel. Please like and subscribe and hit that notification button. So where did a bit of wood come from for the coffee table? A number of years ago a friend of mine asked me if I wanted some firewood. He was clearing up his back garden before putting the house on the market. So sure as not, so I'm always looking for firewood, and I went around with a trailer and a wheelbarrow. And after several sweaty hours of wheeling the wheelbarrow in and out of his garden and packing up the trailer to capacity, he said to me, I've got a couple of other bits of wood, come and have a look in the shed. And sure as nuts, they'd cut down a big maple tree in the back garden that had started to rot. It was around 1.2 meters in diameter and had a big hollow sort of crack down the one side of it, which had filled with water, and the water had started to rot the wood over the years, so I had to get some tree surgeons in to chop it down. While they were there, they asked the tree surgeons to cut 2 slices of the trunk through its diameter, and one of the kids wanted to maybe build a table or something out of it at some stage. But it never got round to it. The kids have all left home, so he said to me, you can stick it on the trailer if you like, and you can burn it. And it's exactly what I thought. I thought, well, it's good heavy wood, it'll burn well. And took it home, and I thought, I'm not going to break that up just yet. Maybe I can do something with it. Even though it looked quite bad, there was bits of rot. You could actually stick your finger into bits. It turned into cork in some areas. And a few months later, maybe a year later, I don't know, I thought, I've seen so many YouTube videos on these river tables that guys do with resin and a bit of tinted blue. I thought I'm gonna have a go with a bit of this maple, and so that's exactly what I did. So I took it outside and started to have a go at shaping the wood. So the first thing I did was I decided to do it outside because it was going to make one enormous mess, and I got my trailer out to serve as a table, or with a bit of plywood on top of it to serve as a table, and used a chainsaw and an angle grinder with all kinds of conceivable discs, including a chainsaw disc and a few Chinese carbide tip discs to start and remove some of the material. Unfortunately, the way it had been cut was not exactly parallel, and it was around probably 10 centimeters on the one side and right down to about 33.5 centimeters on the other side, 35 millimeters, so actually very thin, so I had to be quite careful. So I marked it out as much as I could by eye, and just proceeded with the chainsaw to cut slots in it, and then trying to remove the slots, but in no time my chainsaw was blunt and had to be resharpened. The good wood was extremely hard, and actually quite difficult to remove wood rapidly. So ultimately I decided, well, I'm going to have to buy a decent writer. It's always good things about new projects is to get that machine that you really need to add to your tool collection. So that's exactly what I did. So which writer did I use for planing the coffee table? I decided to invest in this Triton TR001. It's the Triton TR001. It's the bigger model of the two. They make 2 models, and this one has 2,400 watts, so it can really spin a nice large writer bit. It has an RPM range between 8 and 21,000, which is adjustable here at the front. Of course, with some of the bigger bits, you don't want to be going at flat out, so maybe at half the RPM. It has a fine adjust here as well, which is quite handy, so once you get to depth, you can take it down in fractions. It has a normal lock like any writer would have, just a thumb lock like that, so it locks very easily with very low force. It also has a depth stop here with 3 different depth stops which you can adjust, and the depth stop is sprung loaded, so it always returns back, to the. You don't have to let it drop down. Then the plunging of this writer is actually a one-hand operation. So on the right-handed handle here, it has a collar which
which you pull back into the handle, and then you can adjust it to I think 5 increments, 5mm at a time, and makes it very easy for getting to depth and for making the initial rough cuts on this type of work. The switch is also quite natty. So to switch it on, you have to pull back or push back with the same finger. It's just a one-handed operation. A little safety door that covers the switch. You can then switch it on. The door then stays open, and when you want to switch it off in a hurry, the door snaps over it and it will stay off. The Writer also has a vacuum extraction port, which is handy, of course, if you're working indoors. I happen to do everything outdoors, so I didn't make such a mess. It comes with a guide, a surface guide, which you can attach a piece of wood to, so you can run parallel to a piece of wood like most writers. And what another natty thing about this machine is that when you want to install your bit, either in a table or when it's mounted in a table underneath the table, or just normally you would wind the table right down as far as it will go, and normally you need 2 spanners, but this happens to only need 1 because once you lock it up to full extension, the pin is spring loaded and it locks the spindle in place, and of course you can then just tighten or loosen your bit. Now this Writer also has the option to mount in a table, and actually when I bought the Writer, I invested in a very nice Incra surface mount attachment with a magnetic tip which you can buy in different sizes, the surface, so you can access the bits very easily. And I intend actually to mount it in this table when I find the need to do so. And how it works is, another accessory you get with this Writer is this depth stop, particularly for when it's mounted in a table, and it would then slip through this hole here, lock into this little spigot, and automatically attach to the fine adjust. And here you can adjust your Writer, once it's fixed, you can go for it up and down. So very handy. That comes with the Writer as well. Now onto the bits that I used. So the first bit I used was this one here. It's about I guess 40mm. I try to get obviously as big as possible. Well, actually it's 50mm. And the other one here is 55, and it tended to chatter and burn the wood, so it wasn't very successful. I wasn't using enough, wasn't moving wood fast enough for my liking. And I tried this one as well, but yeah, they tend to chatter. The wood is very hard. So ultimately I invested in another Writer bit, and actually just use the opportunity to go and have a look at my Writer organization. I have this little Lazy Susan table, and the Writer bit that I invested in was this big boy here. So I splurged on this Writer bit. It is 65mm, so nearly 3 inches, and it has 4 tungsten carbide tips which are indexable via a little torque screw. That means you have 4 new sharp bits. The ones on the base here are for the surface, to make sure the surface is nice and smooth, cutting smooth, and the ones on the side are for the horizontal feed, cutting as you go along. So that's the Writer bit I used, and the Writer, and the two of them did a great job. I'm very happy. Now onto the sled that I used. Basically just knocked this up. I had some scrap lying around, 2 bits of steel square tubing. This one happens to be, I think, 40mm by 25, so 1 inch by just under 2 inches. What is that? 1.5 inch by 1 inch square tubing, and it has about I guess a 1.6mm wall, so something nice and rigid. And I had some scrap Trespa lying around, and the only reason I used Trespa was because it has a nice smooth surface. You could use something else just to screw onto the back. You can see I just use self-tapping screws and screwed it all the way, so, and nicely recessed so that you don't get any interference with the rails. And you don't have to make this slot by hand, you can do that directly with the writer. So once you've mounted the writer bit, you can just put it in and adjust the height slowly and just take a few cuts until you're through. And of course you don't want your writer to pinch in between here. You've got to make sure it's a nice distance and there's all the way along that it's parallel, and so it slides up and down nice and easily. If it doesn't slide up and down nice and easily, you can also use a little bit of release wax or some sort of wax polish on this surface here in order to make it slide. There's nothing more irritating than this jamming. It needs to ride flat. And then of course you put this on your rails, which are parallel, absolutely parallel. I just use a spirit level to make them parallel and then check them by eye. And then you just move this maybe 3/4 of the width of the bit. I didn't do a full bit width every time, so maybe 3/4 of the bit width every time as a cutting depth. And I think I could cut anything up to maybe 5mm cuts with this, but it can really eat wood. And of course, with running a 65mm bit or 2.5-inch writer bit, you cannot use this at 24,000 RPM. You have to slow it down. So I think I ran it probably at 15,000, maybe even 10,000. So you can adjust it to make sure it doesn't burn the wood and to get your feed up. So that's the sled.
So these are just the 2 bits of truss bar used under my slide, and the 2 bits of rectangular steel tube, just before screwing them to the base, and then ultimately going to plunge the writer through to make the 65mm slot along the length of the sled, making sure you don't go right through the ends, also it will fall apart. So here's me starting to set up a bit of wood just to take off the really high stuff first, and enjoying a very powerful writer that could take some serious cuts and create a load of sawdust. I think I was probably taking initially 5 or 6mm cuts, and then before you get too serious, I set up a set of wedges just to make sure I wanted to take off the really high stuff and get it as parallel as possible without removing the wrong side of the wood. So this is just a little view of some of the start to the cleanup, and you start to see the grain coming out. It's actually quite satisfying to watch, and of course it's a little bit back-breaking because it's quite 1.2 meters is quite a reach to push the writer up and down. So I could cut on both strokes, but you eventually discover where it's smoothest, on the back stroke or the forward stroke, creating I don't know, I must have about 10 black bags full of sawdust. And once I got the one side completely flatted, I took a belt sander to it to smooth it out and to get a good look at how the grain was going to come out and see if it actually would look good, because it was quite a lot of water damage, as you can see, but actually it ultimately ended up like a feature. So now I've got the bit of wood flipped upside down. It's now a lot simpler because it's now flat on one side and you can just put it directly on. Here's typically what the cutter looks like, making a 5mm cut, and I proceed to remove the top ridge. It was probably still about 80 millimeter, 8 centimeters thick. However, the challenge was that because the chainsaw had sort of gone off course when they had cut this slice, there was still a very narrow part. As you can see here in a minute, on the right hand bottom side of the screen, you can see how thin it is. So I decided to take the middle out first. So then, in order to keep as much material on the board as possible, I decided to make a giant cone, if you like, or a flat cone. So I hot glued a spike or a nail to the bottom of the already planed side and stuck it through a hole in the plywood so that I could rotate the base, and then made uneven rails. You can see the rail on the left is higher than the one on the right, and then made a taper. So I then ran the writer just up and down the one side of the table until I got to the thickness required on the outside, and then just turned it by hand, just turned the wood by hand or rotated the wood by hand as I righted, and eventually started to get a very nice cone. And the cuts were small enough in order that the cone could then be smoothened out. Of course, it's on the underside of the table, so it didn't really matter so much, but you want it to look nice. It actually worked exceptionally well, and I ended up with around 35mm thick on the outside and around 60mm on the inside, so a nice big flat cone. Now the next challenge was doing the live edge, as they call it, and most guys advise to remove all the bark, but this bark was so tough and it looked fantastic, so I took a wire brush to it, and it seemed to be very well attached still to the main wood, so I quite liked the dark feature, so I decided to leave it and just brush it and sand it in place. And this is a quick look at what it started to look like once I started to remove some of the rotten bits. And I mostly used a power file to do this, as well as a Dremel and chisels and whatever else I could get my hands on. And the next part was to try and stabilize the big part that was missing in the top by using bow ties with a little bit of a bridge in between. Normally these are mounted on the top of the table as a little bit of a feature to give the table some character, but I didn't like that, so I decided to mount them underneath. And this is just me clamping them in place in order to mark the table to then write the part that needed to be removed in order to get them to fit. And here you go, you can see I've righted them out and now chiseling them to fit them in place. And you can see I've clamped a straight edge underneath just to hold them nice and parallel to keep the table nice and firm together, ultimately getting a really good fit, and gluing them in place with a few clamps, and also then see how once it's sanded flush I thought it looks good. And I also trimmed the bridge between the bow tie a little bit to make it look a little bit more funky. Now on to also removing the loose bark that has grown in between the folds in the tree trunk. A bit of a challenge, but get out as much of the loose stuff as possible. Then on to the resin, and I bought a product called Glass Cast 50. It's a 50mm. You can cast 50mm deep in one go, from a company called easycomposites. They're really a UK-based company, but they've also got warehouses in the EU. They're also a wealth of information. They have a YouTube channel, as well as whatever you're doing, carbon fiber, fiberglass. They've really got a wealth of knowledge and professional service. I've used them for quite a number of years, and very, very happy with them. So the next thing is to seal as much as possible all the loose areas to try and avoid bubbles later. This is advised. Some people don't do it, but I decided to go right around the bark on the outside of the table and into all the nooks and crannies everywhere I could get just a brush with some resin. And I use a combination of cardboard, first lined with flashing tape. So flashing tape you can also buy from a fiberglass resin supplier. That's to avoid the cardboard sticking to the resin. So flashing tape first, and then I used a hot air gun to seal it up to the wood wherever possible. So make sure everything is sealed up before you make your first pour. See, I've sort of painted over all the everywhere as possible, and also made cardboard dams on the outside wall. I just used cardboard with flashing tape to make little dams to dam up the resin here and there,
Make sure it didn't run all over the place, because once it starts running, it's virtually impossible to stop it leaking. So make sure you spend plenty of time in the beginning to make sure the board is sealed up correctly. Now on to the part where I tint the first bit of resin with this shimmer metallic blue. In fact, it was an electric blue I used. And just the first 10 or 12 millimeters, I poured a shallow section at the base and then filled the rest up with clear resin to give it a nice 3D effect, and that you don't completely hide all the lovely shapes in the wood where the rotten wood had been taken out. In order to get the desired effect, you take like a sharpened toothpick or something like that and keep playing with the poured blue solution, and you can create various patterns. Even when it's quite far curing, you can still tend to mess around with the pattern in the blue to get the desired effect, and it really comes out beautifully if it's done properly. You can then see how once the resin is cured and it flipped the table upside down, if the blue was flush with the top, then you wouldn't get that nice 3D effect. So it's the reason I only put the blue at the bottom and then filled up with clear epoxy, and then you get this fantastic pool or translucent 3D effect, which gives the table lots of depth and really makes a great showpiece. I tried to do exactly the same thing with the folds in the tree trunk, so sort of make them look like arteries or river arteries. You can see how crystal clear the resin comes out. Of course, there's still lots of sanding and polishing to be done later on, once you get the table all nice and smooth. You can see the first start at sanding here. Starting to polish up some of these little arteries or river arteries, and wonderful how the resin sinks in and the wood and the mottling effect of the wood comes to the top.
So in order to make the frame for the coffee table, I wanted to make something a little bit understated, and so I just used a bit of square solid 12mm wrought iron. It's not that expensive and quite nice to weld because it doesn't burn through. Now, how did I bend it? I don't have a bending jig for this type of material, so you could have used started off by using a big shifting spanner or a big boy like this. Got plenty of leverage. You can bend away with this. The challenge is once you get further down, you have no leverage. You can't use it sideways. So what I decided to do was make a little bending lever as long as possible. This one's probably 1.2 meters. And I have drilled a couple of holes in the end. Ideally, this should be solid, so you want it as strong as possible. You can even see I managed to bend it a bit. I put in 2 M12 cap screws and filled the gap here with washers. If it was solid, you wouldn't need that. And then just use these two, the heads of the cap screws as lugs. And then, of course, you have plenty of leverage. Anywhere you go, hold it nice and solid, and then you can bend it in all different directions, adjust it, as you go along. And every now and again, I just took it off, and then if you wanted it really sharp, you could really bend it if you wanted to. So, I ended up with whatever shape you wanted to, and I even reversed the bends, and it worked quite well. The challenge was to try and keep it is in one plane, so a bit of hammering and bending before I got it totally right. But and then ultimately just welded the ends together, and that was it. So that's how I got away with making the base without a bending jig, just a simple lever.
So here you can see how the complete frame has been put together. Weld the two ends together and then start to add the three legs at a slight angle outwards to give the table a little bit more purchase. I used a protractor with a combination of magnets to hold them at the same angle in all three locations and to keep them as parallel as possible. Of course, you've got to go around with an angle grinder and clean up with a flat disc all the black scale and all the weld splatter before you send it away for powder coating. I decided to go for a matte black finish, so no gloss finishes. It came out actually pretty well. And then the next step was putting it together. I managed to convince somebody to cut a bit of glass for it as well. And the first shots of the table being put together without a finish on the top. Just been sanded, and the underside with a felt on the feet. And this is how I did fitted the feet to the deck. I just drilled a pilot hole and used 8mm coach bolts, and that was fine. Didn't really need to use an insert. It was solid enough. There's no tension on it anyway, so that seemed to work perfectly.
I'll quickly go over the 3 feet. They're made out of a bit of off-cut ash I had. Solid ash. It's about 50mm thick. And they're all 3 of them are individually shaped based on the frame shape. So I just put them on there and expanded it to the inside and the outside. You can see this one is totally different, and the one over there is almost like an S-bend. And then I ran a big heavy right around it, a big round over bit, and then put them in place and marked out and righted out a recess so that the frame would go in just over halfway, and that would mean that it would give the glass on the inside somewhat nice to sit on, so it locates in between the frame so it can't move, and then it rests just neatly on the inside of the foot in all 3 cases, so it's nicely perfectly balanced. And then I secured the feet to the steel frame with just 2 cap screw bolts drilled from underneath. You could use self-tappers, but I tapped blind holes in the base of these, just I think M6 blind holes, and then recessed them from underneath, and then put a bit of felt on each of the 3 feet. This is the writer bit that I've actually had in my collection probably for 20 years and never used it once. And so when it got to the feet, I thought I must have a go at using this big boy. It is 75mm in diameter, 3 inch in diameter, and boy does it cut beautifully. It was brand new and never used. I picked it up somewhere secondhand in a secondhand shop, I think in South Africa, and it worked a treat.
So finally, the big reveal. It was actually for Christmas, a present for my wife, and the finish I used on it was a product called Hard Oily, or directly translated Hard Oily, from the Netherlands. And it's a matte sort of oil-based finish that dried very hard and went right into the wood. Put it on several times until it stopped going in, and then wiped the rest off. And it actually resisted moisture and everything. So the wood actually seemed to have changed color over the last couple of years. And ultimately, I finished it with linseed oil and wax mixture I made up myself, and it's starting to look lovely now, and the marbly effect, as you will see from these final few pictures of it, really comes out beautifully. And I hope this project inspired you as much as it did me, and gets you out there and to fix up an old bit of wood that maybe looks like it should be for the fire, and ultimately turns into a lovely piece of furniture. Enjoy, and please like and subscribe.